Hello, it's math time with Mrs. Depperschmidt. We're going to continue our work with fractions today and work out some real-world problems, some situations involving fractions where it's necessary to add or subtract with fractions. We talked about the big main rules of fractions. Rule number 0 is that anything you do to the numerator, you must also always do to the denominator. We'll keep that in mind as we are working with our fractions, finding the equivalent fractions in order to add and subtract. The next big rule of fractions, rule number 1, is when you will add and subtract, you must always do that with fractions having the same denominator. So here we go. Let's solve some problems. The first problem is going to be about children sharing a grapefruit. And then we'll talk about pumpkin pie. Hopefully it doesn't make you too hungry, and we will have a great time with these. We're going to talk about Elena and Lee and Sarah. They're sharing a grapefruit. Elena is going to eat 1/3 of the grapefruit. Lee gets 1/9, and Sarah is having 3/9. Now we know that grapefruits are a sphere and they come in wedge-shaped sections, but I've drawn a fraction bar here that is cut into 9 approximately equal parts. We're using this as a model to represent, so it doesn't matter that they're not exactly the right size in relation to each other. It's important that we're thinking about a food that people can eat. It's a grapefruit, and there are 9 pieces altogether. In order to find out how much is eaten all together, we're going to add everybody's amount. We'll add Elena's 1/3, Lee's 1/9, and Sarah's 3/9. But what I just said about fractions is for adding and subtracting, we must use the same denominator. I'll also add some detail to my illustration to help us see how the parts work out. Elena is eating 1/3 of the grapefruit, but in order to do this addition problem, we need to use 9ths. So we'll calculate the equivalent fraction. 1/3 is the same as 3/9, because we can have 3/9, 3/9, and 3/9, and that would make a whole. So it takes 3 sets of 3/9 to make a whole grapefruit. Lee is only having 1/9 of the grapefruit, and Sarah is eating 3/9. I'm pretty certain that you can add 3/9 plus 3/9 together with 1/9, and we'll get a total of 7/9. That's how many sections or parts of the grapefruit are eaten. Not much different than the fraction problems we've been solving during class at school. Next, let's move on and do a problem with pumpkin pie. We're talking about Cheryl and Dennis, maybe they're brother and sister, and we'll see that Cheryl eats 2/5 of the pumpkin pie. Dennis is eating 3/10 of the pumpkin pie. In this problem, we're going to find out how much of the pumpkin pie is left when they're finished. Again, I've drawn a fraction bar that's cut into 10 pieces to represent the 10 parts of the pumpkin pie. We need to notice that the denominators are not the same, so before we can do any adding and subtracting, we must find an equivalent fraction for Cheryl's 2/5 so that there's a common denominator, so that both quantities can be manipulated with each other. Well, here we go. I've also added some details here. Cheryl's 2/5 is an equivalent fraction for 4/10. I multiplied the numerator and denominator both by 2 to find that equivalent fraction, and I know that my denominator must be tenths so that we can work with these together. We need to find out how much of the pumpkin pie is left over after the two have enjoyed their dessert. I just realized that I didn't quite model this illustration quite right. I added this bracket to Cheryl's amount, her 4/10 that she's eating. Dennis is eating 3/10. From the picture, it's quite plain to see. I'll go back here. We can see how much of the pumpkin pie is left over, but we're going to add up all the pie that got eaten. 4/10 added together with 3/10 makes 7/10 of the pie that was eaten. We started with a whole pie, which is 10/10. Taking away the 7/10 that were eaten, leave us with 3/10 of the pie. And that answers the question that was posed at the very beginning. Adding and subtracting with fractions is something that's new for many of us, but it's not complicated as long as you remember rule number 0 and rule number 1 about fractions. And I'd like to zoom in on the fraction posters that we made at school to remind you of our 2 rules. Turn the camera. And we're coming over here to the posters with fraction rule number 1 and fraction rule number 2. Here we have the first. Let's step back. Okay. Fraction rule number 1. In order to add or subtract, we must use the same denominator. And then below it, fraction rule number 0. Whatever we do to the denominator, we must do to the numerator. There's a good view of that. Always remember that when we're working with fractions, and things will work out fine every time. I hope you're having a great day. Remember to be kind. I'll see you at school.